This puppy waited for someone who never came. Every evening, as the sun disappeared behind the fields, a tiny brown and white puppy would crawl beneath the frame of a broken bicycle and curl himself into a little ball, resting his head against one of the rusty tires as if he were waiting for a familiar pair of footsteps to return. The bicycle had been abandoned beside a dirt road at the edge of a quiet farming village, its chain hanging loose, one pedal missing, and its front tire completely flat. But to the puppy, it was more than an old piece of metal. It was shelter. It was the only thing that kept the cold wind away at night, and somehow, in his little mind, it seemed to be the place where the person he was waiting for might come back. Nobody knew exactly how long he had been there. Some villagers said they had seen him for several days. Others said it had been much longer. He was thin, covered in dust, and so weak that even standing for a few minutes seemed difficult. During the day, he would sit beside the road watching every person who passed. Whenever he heard footsteps, his ears would rise. Whenever he heard a vehicle approaching, his tiny tail would begin to wag. And whenever someone slowed down, the puppy would stand and stare, hoping that maybe this was the moment his owner had finally returned. But every time, the footsteps continued past him. Every vehicle disappeared down the road. And every night the puppy went back to the broken bicycle. He had learned the painful rhythm of waiting. Morning came. People passed. Evening came. Nobody came for him. Then one cold morning, a farmer named Daniel was driving his old pickup toward his fields. Daniel had lived in the area for most of his life. He knew almost every road, every fence, and nearly every animal that wandered around the farms. As he drove past the broken bicycle, something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a pile of dirty cloth beneath the frame. Then the little shape moved. Daniel slowed the truck and looked again. Two tired eyes were watching him. The puppy had lifted his head from the ground, and for a moment his entire face seemed to change. His ears came forward. His tail moved once against the dirt. He looked hopeful. Daniel stopped the truck. He stepped out and walked slowly toward him. The puppy did not run. That was the first thing that worried Daniel. Most stray puppies would be frightened and run away when a stranger approached, but this puppy was too exhausted to run. He simply sat beside the bicycle and watched Daniel come closer. Daniel crouched down several feet away. "Hey, little guy," he said softly. The puppy tilted his head. Daniel reached into his truck and pulled out a small piece of bread from his lunch. He placed it on the ground and backed away. The puppy stared at the bread, then at Daniel, as if he couldn't believe the food was really for him. Slowly, he crawled forward. He took one tiny bite, then another. Within seconds, he was eating as quickly as his weak body allowed. Daniel watched silently. The puppy was starving. Not just hungry, starving. Daniel looked at the broken bicycle, then at the puppy, and something inside him hurt. "How long have you been out here?" he whispered. The puppy had no answer. He only looked toward the road again. That was when Daniel understood that this little animal wasn't simply hiding beneath a bicycle. He was waiting for someone. Maybe an owner, maybe a family, maybe a person who had promised to come back, and that person never came. Daniel couldn't leave him there. He slowly picked up the puppy, and the little animal was so light that Daniel could feel every bone beneath his fur. The puppy rested his head against Daniel's jacket without fighting. It was almost as if he had finally become too tired to hope, and now he was simply grateful that someone had stopped. Daniel carried him to the truck and wrapped him in an old blanket. As he placed the puppy on the passenger seat, the little dog looked through the window toward the broken bicycle. He kept staring at it until Daniel started the engine. Daniel paused for a moment. He looked at the puppy and said, "You don't have to wait anymore." Then he drove away. The trip to the farm was only a few minutes, but for the puppy, it was the beginning of an entirely different life. Daniel brought him inside a small barn where it was warm and dry. He gave him clean water and a proper meal, but the puppy was too weak to eat much. Daniel didn't rush him. He stayed nearby and let the puppy rest. That night, Daniel placed a soft blanket beside a heater and left a bowl of water nearby. The puppy curled into the blanket, but he didn't sleep immediately. Every few minutes, he lifted his head and looked toward the barn door. It seemed like he was still waiting for someone to appear. Daniel sat beside him. "You're safe here," he whispered. "Nobody is leaving you tonight." The puppy slowly lowered his head again. For the first time in who knows how long, he fell asleep without the cold ground beneath him. The next morning, Daniel discovered that the puppy had a little more energy. He was still weak, but when Daniel entered the barn, the puppy tried to stand. His legs shook. He almost fell, but he kept trying. Daniel smiled. "That's it, buddy. One step at a time." Over the next several days, Daniel gave him small meals, fresh water, warm blankets, and plenty of rest. Slowly, the puppy began to change. His eyes became brighter. His fur became cleaner. His ribs were no longer as visible. And then one morning, something happened that Daniel had been waiting for. The puppy wagged his tail, not once, not by accident. He saw Daniel walk into the barn, and his entire body began to wiggle with excitement. Daniel laughed. "Are you happy to see me?" The puppy took a few unsteady steps toward him. Then he leaned against Daniel's legs. It was a tiny gesture, but to Daniel, it meant everything. The puppy was beginning to trust again. He no longer looked toward the road every few minutes. He no longer slept beneath cold metal. He no longer waited beside the broken bicycle. He had found warmth. He had found food. But most importantly, he had found someone who came back. As the weeks passed, the puppy became stronger. Daniel named him Rusty, partly because of the old rusty bicycle where he had found him. Rusty loved following Daniel around the farm. He followed him to the barn in the morning, walked behind him through the fields, and waited patiently whenever Daniel repaired equipment. He even started carrying small sticks around the yard, proudly showing them to anyone who would look. The frightened puppy, who once barely had the strength to stand, had become playful and curious. One afternoon, Daniel was repairing a fence when Rusty suddenly ran across the field after him. Daniel turned around and saw the puppy racing toward him with his ears bouncing and his tail moving like a little flag. Daniel stopped what he was doing and laughed. "Look at you!" Rusty ran straight into his legs. Daniel crouched down and hugged him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The farmer thought about the day he had found him, lying beneath that broken bicycle, waiting for someone who never came. Then he looked at the happy dog in his arms and realized something. Sometimes, the person you are waiting for isn't the person who will save you. Sometimes life sends someone completely unexpected. Someone who sees you. Someone who stops. Someone who decides that your story isn't over yet. Months passed, and Rusty grew into a healthy, energetic dog. His fur became thick and shiny. His eyes were bright. He loved running across the fields and chasing birds that were far too fast for him to catch. But there was one thing he never forgot. Whenever Daniel drove past the old dirt road, Rusty would lift his head and look out the window. One day, Daniel decided to stop. The broken bicycle was still there. Rusty climbed out of the truck and stood quietly beside it. He sniffed the ground. He walked around the old frame. Then he looked at Daniel. There was no fear in his eyes anymore. There was no sadness. The puppy who had once slept beneath that bicycle was gone. In his place stood a healthy dog who had a home. Daniel knelt beside him. "You don't need this anymore," he said. Rusty wagged his tail. Then, instead of lying beneath the bicycle, he turned around and ran back toward Daniel. That simple moment said everything. Rusty had finally stopped waiting for the person who never came. He had chosen the person who did. Daniel loaded him back into the truck, and together they drove home as the sun began to set over the fields. The old bicycle remained beside the road, slowly disappearing beneath dust and weeds. But its story had already served its purpose. It had been the shelter that kept a lonely puppy alive until someone kind enough came along. And maybe that's what makes this story so powerful. Rusty didn't need a perfect rescue. He didn't need someone famous or rich or important. He just needed one person to notice him, one person to stop, one person to say, "You don't have to wait anymore." And sometimes, that's all it takes to change a life. Somewhere on that farm, Rusty was now sleeping in a warm bed instead of beneath a broken bicycle. He was no longer counting footsteps on a dirt road. He was no longer watching every passing truck disappear into the distance. He finally understood that being abandoned was not the end of his story. It was simply the chapter before someone found him. And every night when Daniel closed the barn door, Rusty followed him home with his tail wagging, knowing that tomorrow morning someone would come back for him. Because the puppy who once waited for someone who never came had finally found someone who always would.